Hi everyone, welcome to part one of World War I. Our questions to think about here: why does World War I start, and how does the US initially try to stay out of the war? The first thing that we have to keep in mind here is that World War I wasn't called World War I until after World War II. It was referred to as the Great War, and the war itself begins in 1914 and would last through 1918. So that's our time frame here. But leading into that, at the end of the 19th century, there was a growing sense of nationalism in Europe. Germany and Italy had recently consolidated into nations we think of today, as opposed to the confederated principalities they had been. There was also a growing sense of militarism on the continent. Germany and France had fought a war in 1870, 1871, and Germany had secured the Alsace-Lorraine region that had previously been part of France. France had built up its military to compete with the Germans, who were steadily improving the size and strength of their military. There was also a shifting balance of power in Europe. Britain was slowly losing its dominance, and Germany was growing in power. And the resulting evening of the power created an increasingly unstable situation. In addition, there was a web of alliances entangling nations, maximizing the risk that a local conflict could produce a wider war. At the start of the war, the so-called Central Powers were made up of Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. Initially, Italy was part of this alliance, but once the war breaks out, they switch sides. And then the Triple Entente, or what we call the Allies, was made up of Britain, France, and Russia. And the question is, why do we consider this a world war? When you take a look at the other map, all of the nations in green are allied with the Triple Entente, and all of the nations in orange are allied with the Central Powers. So it's truly a world war. When we look at these four main causes of World War I, they really build up over time, and the situation has been described as a powder keg, and all we really needed was a spark to launch the whole thing into an inferno. A Bosnian assassin linked to a Serbian nationalist organization called the Black Hand assassinated the Archduke who was the heir of the Austro-Hungarian Empire on June 28, 1914. And this is a group that wanted autonomy for Bosnia, which at the time was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria-Hungary demanded that Serbia turn over these officials and others who were involved in this organization. Serbia is going to refuse, and they're going to be backed by their secret ally, Russia. So Russia is going to help to instigate this war by helping Serbia not to back down. Germany, meanwhile, is going to be pressuring Austria-Hungary to be more aggressive. So we have a situation where what could have been a small-scale conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, it launches us into the war. So where is the United States in all of this? Basically 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean, trying not to look. Woodrow Wilson was the president of the United States at the time, and he urged Americans to be neutral, quote, in thought as well as in action. But in general, most Americans accepted neutrality because they saw no need to enter the conflict, especially after it bogs down into a slow, bloody trench warfare. Some did favor the Central Powers. We had large numbers of German and Irish Americans. The Irish Americans actually wanted to see Britain lose this conflict because they wanted Ireland to be an independent nation. But most Americans saw German militarism as a potential danger to the United States, and many people blamed Germany for starting the war because Germany seemed arrogant and militaristic. Sea power was very important for the European war, with the importation of food and supplies and the exportation of goods to pay for the war. Britain had traditionally been the strongest naval power in the world, but Germany was definitely making technological advancements, especially with submarines or the undersea boats or the U-boats. Britain had ordered ships carrying German goods via neutral ports to be stopped, including American ships, which they sometimes stopped and confiscated their cargo. So the British are going to be blockading the North Sea to prevent any sort of goods or supplies from coming into Germany. Woodrow Wilson is going to protest the infringements on neutral rights because the United States is a neutral nation and we should be able to trade with whomever we wish. But there really wasn't much he could do about it. The Germans had declared a zone around the British Isles to be off limits to shipping, and they threatened to sink any ships that made their way into the area. Woodrow Wilson again called this a violation of neutral rights, and his Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, had urged Wilson to forbid Americans to travel into the war zones. But President Wilson, who was determined to stand by the principles of international law, refused to do so. The German sinking of 2 ships divided the administration on the course of action. On May 1st, 1915, the German embassy in New York had published warnings in American newspapers, including the New York World, against Americans traveling into the war zone. But despite that warnings, Americans did. On May 7th, 1915, the British passenger liner, the Lusitania, was hit by a torpedo and sunk. Among the dead were 128 Americans out of the total 1,198 dead. The Americans are going to protest the sinking of the Lusitania in a series of diplomatic notes that really don't have much of an impact. The Germans responded by arguing that the ship was armed. It was not. They also argued that it was secretly carrying a cargo of rifles and ammunitions that its passengers didn't know about. This was true. After another incident in 1916, the Germans agreed not to attack passenger ships without warning. In 1917, the British had intercepted a message from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico. This message was shocking. It encourages Mexico to invade the United States, and in return, Germany would help them regain the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The British presented the message to President Wilson on February 25th and made it public March 1st, 1917. Many Americans used the Zimmermann telegram as an argument for going to war with Germany. President Wilson is not yet convinced that is the best course of action, but he does make the decision to arm merchant ships. In February of 1917, the Germans are also going to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. They are really gambling here. They know that attacks on merchant ships will eventually draw the United States into the conflict. But Germany is going to bet that they can force Britain out of the war by attacking shipping sooner than it would draw Americans into the war. So unrestricted submarine warfare is they're going to shoot and sink anything they come across. Between March 12th and March 21st, German U-boats sank 5 American ships, and President Wilson decided that it was time to act. On April 2nd, 1917, President Wilson makes a presentation to Congress that war is necessary to, quote, make the world safe for democracy. And then on April 4th, 1917, Congress issued the formal declaration of war. So coming back to our questions to think about, why does World War I start? We have this series of sort of building causes: nationalism, militarism, the shifting balance of power, and the entangling alliances. But the spark that starts the war is the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And then the second question, how does the United States initially try to stay out of the war? By maintaining freedom of the seas, that we are a neutral nation, that we should be able to trade with whomever we want. Of course, the sinking of the Lusitania and other passenger ships is going to make that more difficult. Also, the issuing of the Zimmerman telegram is going to call for Americans to demand that the United States go to war. But it's not until Germany resumes unrestricted submarine warfare that the United States actually declares war. So stay tuned for part 2 of World War I.